So there is a lot of myths and a lot of misconceptions around combat sports and around training practices. So in this section, we're going to talk about what are those common myths and misconceptions and why they're not necessarily the case. So one really common myth and misconception is that strength training will make me big and bulky. When we're strength training, it takes quite a long amount of time for us to build an appreciable amount of muscle mass. So in our general preparation phase, for example, where we're focusing on building muscle mass and we're doing relatively high volumes of training, the amount of training that we're doing, and given that we're also performing some endurance training where we're expending relatively large amounts of energy, we'd probably, at the maximum, only put on a few kilos of mass within this phase. So it does take us a long amount of time to build an appreciable amount of muscle mass. We can also do strength training of high intensity and low volumes, and that gets us stronger without increasing our muscle mass. We also need to be aware that performing strength training isn't going to compromise our speed, particularly because we're performing power training later in our yearly program. So we can perform strength training without the worry that the speed of our movements is going to suffer. If anything, strength training can actually increase our ability to move quickly, because our ability to move quickly is dependent upon power, and our power is somewhat dependent upon how much force we can produce. So if we strength train, we increase the force we're capable of, that increases our power, and that in turn can increase our speed. Our next myth is that we can only improve our endurance capacity by running for really long, slow distances. So we've obviously covered this within our training course, but we do also see improvements in our endurance capacity when we perform interval training. And if we solely perform interval training that focuses on improving anaerobic capacity, there is also research to show that this can improve our aerobic capacity. The misconception that we only improve our aerobic capacity by performing long, slow distance running is actually a myth. We can improve our endurance capacity by performing things like interval training. Typically within our combat sports, we would opt to prioritize our anaerobic training or our interval training as well, purely because this is a bit more specific to the format of our actual fights, where we have rounds that last for a few minutes with rest periods in between. So this actually mimics our anaerobic training and vice versa. So by performing our anaerobic training or our interval training, this actually prepares us more appropriately for our fights. Our next myth is that we need to train to exhaustion for that training to be effective. So this is a very common and a very old school kind of myth, but typically when we're performing to exhaustion, the quality of the actions or the quality of the repetitions that we're actually completing in that exhausted state is not quality enough for us to adapt appropriately. So this is very important for things like power and when we're performing skill-based training. While we do need to perform some training in a fatigued state, so we get used to performing when we're fatigued because we're going to get fatigued during a bout, if we perform lots of training in that fatigued state, the quality of our actions diminishes and we don't actually get too many returns from that type of training. If we perform lots of training where we perform to exhaustion as well, that also increases our risk of overtraining and may lead to decrements in performance and an increased risk of injury. Our next myth is that we have certain exercises that are bad for certain body parts. So for example, one thing that we see very commonly is that squats or deadlifts can be very bad for our backs. And this isn't true. What's often the case is that the improper performance of these exercises or the improper prescription of these exercises is the thing that often leads to injury. So there will obviously be some instances where certain exercises may not be appropriate. So for example, someone with low back pain, we may actually require a modification to the way they perform the deadlift in order to not exacerbate that pain or make that pain more intense. But it is actually a myth that there are certain exercises that lead to specific injuries. There's also the misconception that resistance training will stunt an athlete's growth if they perform that resistance training at a young age. And again, this isn't true, particularly if our athlete is getting the appropriate amount of nutrition. So we mentioned previously that as long as we replenish our energy stores and we're not working in an energy deficit, then performing resistance training won't stunt our growth. And there's actually lots of evidence to suggest that resistance training can increase the density of our bones and reduce our risk of bone fracture. So not only does it increase our strength and power, which improves our performance, it can minimize our risk of bone fracture and other injuries as well. So our final myth is that strength training will reduce our flexibility. And again, this isn't true. A lot of strength exercises actually get us into positions where we're working at extremes in terms of range of motion. So if we think about the bottom position of a squat or the bottom position of a deadlift, this actually requires a decent amount of flexibility at the specific joints worked. So strength training won't reduce our flexibility. Now, particularly as well, if we're designating even a small amount of time to some range of motion or some flexibility training, we definitely won't see any decrements in our range of motion. So another common misconception is that striking training while holding dumbbells can improve our striking force and our striking power. So this isn't the case, because when we're holding dumbbells and when we're attempting to strike while we're holding dumbbells, it actually changes the biomechanics or changes the way we perform the strike, and it almost becomes a different skill. So if we wanted to improve our strength or our power in these movements, we'd be better off performing something that generally improves our strength and power, and we'd usually see some transfer to those striking movements. So exercises such as a medicine ball throw that incorporate those same muscle groups involved in our striking movements, those types of exercises and focusing on power production within those exercises are likely to be effective for improving our power during a striking movement.